Blood pooled dark against cracked asphalt, staining white canvas sneakers a horrifying crimson. The boy lay gasping, 14 years old, ribs shattered from the inside lungs, struggling to pull air past the damage a 6-inch blade had carved into his gut. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, growing closer but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough. Then another sound cut through the night, a deep guttural roar that made windows rattle in their frames, a sound that grew and grew until it drowned out everything else. Headlights appeared through the midnight fog like vengeful eyes, hundreds of them burning through the mist that clung to the streets of Bakersfield. 200 Harley-Davidsons rolled down the arterial roads leading to Memorial Hospital, their chrome exhausts catching the sickly yellow glow of streetlights. They had not come for peace. They had come for a dying boy who had shown more raw courage in 30 seconds than most men manage in a lifetime. The Hells Angels were riding to war, and the entire San Joaquin Valley was about to learn what happened when you touched something they considered sacred. But that reckoning was still hours away. The story began 68 hours earlier in a world that had no idea it was about to be torn apart. Oildale, California sat just north of Bakersfield, like a forgotten stepchild. A sun-scorched grid of pump jacks, chain-link fences, and streets that had given up trying to look respectable decades ago. It was the kind of place where ambition went to die quietly, where men worked oil rigs and auto body shops and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors. The heat in October was still brutal, the kind that made asphalt soft underfoot and turned car interiors into ovens. Eli Dalton was not built for Oildale's particular brand of harshness. At 14, he was all sharp angles and nervous energy, standing 5'6" and weighing maybe 112 pounds if he stuffed his pockets with rocks. His hair was dark brown and perpetually messy, falling into eyes that seemed too old for his face. There was a wariness in those eyes, a careful calculation that came from learning early that the world didn't hand out favors. He spent his afternoons at Henderson's Hardware on Chester Avenue, a cramped shop that smelled of sawdust and machine oil, in the particular metallic tang of brass fittings that had been sitting in bins since the Reagan administration. Old man Henderson paid him $9 an hour under the table to sweep floors, stock shelves, and occasionally help customers find the right size bolt or washer. It wasn't much, but it was steady, and Eli had learned that steady mattered more than big. The work suited him. There was a quiet dignity in organizing the chaos of nuts and bolts, in making sense of the jumbled mess of tools and parts that accumulated in a hardware store. He liked the customers who knew exactly what they needed and the puzzle of helping the ones who didn't. Most of all, he liked being useful, being needed. His mother, Nora Dalton, worked 2 shifts at Millie's Diner on the east side, pouring coffee and slinging plates from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then again from 6 at night until midnight, 3 days a week. She was 39 but looked older, the kind of worn-down tired that came from carrying too much weight for too long. Her hands were always red and raw from dishwater and cleaning chemicals, her uniform always smelling of fryer grease and yesterday's coffee. They lived in a rental house on Beardsley Street, a 2-bedroom box with peeling paint and a front yard that was more dirt than grass. The rent was $800 a month, which might as well have been $8,000 for all the struggle it took to scrape it together every 30 days. But it was theirs, or close enough, and Nora kept it clean even when she was dead on her feet. Eli's father had died 6 years ago, not in any kind of noble way, not in a blaze of glory or a dramatic sacrifice. Calvin Dalton had been crushed in a factory collapse at the industrial park on the south side of Bakersfield, buried under 2 tons of steel shelving that gave way during a forklift accident. They'd pulled his body out 14 hours later. Eli had been 8, old enough to remember, young enough that the memories felt like photographs from someone else's life. Calvin had left behind exactly one thing of value: a silver pocket watch, tarnished and dented, with a winding stem that stuck sometimes, and a crystal face that had cracked in 3 places. On the back, engraved in careful script, were 6 words that Eli had memorized without trying: do what's right, not what's easy. Every night before bed, Eli held that watch in his palm and turned it over, reading those words by the yellow light of his bedside lamp. He didn't wind it. The mechanism had broken years ago. But he carried it anyway, a talisman against a world that seemed designed to grind people like him into dust. At Oildale Junior High, Eli was functionally invisible. He sat in the back of classrooms, ate lunch alone, under the covered walkway near the gym, and moved through the hallways like smoke. It wasn't that he was bullied exactly. Bullies need to notice you first, and Eli had cultivated the art of being overlooked. Gray t-shirts, jeans from the thrift store on Union Avenue, canvas sneakers that he'd repaired twice with duct tape. Nothing that drew the eye. Then Fallon Kane transferred in on a Tuesday in mid-October, and everything changed. She walked into third period history like she was daring anyone to comment. 13 years old with sharp blue eyes that seemed to cut right through the usual teenage nonsense and see something truer underneath. She wore a faded denim jacket over a black t-shirt, scuffed combat boots that looked like they'd seen actual combat, and an expression that warned the world to keep its distance. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to be neat somewhere around second period. The teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, introduced her with the kind of bright, false cheer that adults use when they were deeply uncomfortable. "Class, this is Fallon Kane. She's joining us from San Bernardino. Let's make her feel welcome." Nobody made her feel welcome. Nobody made her feel anything at all. The kids in Oildale Junior High had heard the name. Kane had seen the massive man who dropped her off that first morning on a Road King motorcycle that sounded like rolling thunder. They knew what the patches on his leather cut meant. The Death's Head skull with wings. The top and bottom rockers that read Hell's Angels in San Bernardino in letters that looked like they'd been painted in blood and defiance. Grady Ironclad Kane was not the kind of father who showed up for parent-teacher conferences. He was the kind who made grown men cross the street to avoid eye contact. 6'4", built like a brick wall that had been carved into the rough shape of a human being. His arms were tapestries of faded ink images that told stories most people didn't want to know. He'd worn that leather cut for 28 years, earned every patch the hard way, and the club was more than family to him. It was blood and bone and the only law that mattered. So the kids at school gave Fallon a wide berth. They whispered when she walked past, fell silent when she entered a room, treated her like she was radioactive, which meant she sat alone at lunch, same as Eli though, for very different reasons. He noticed her on the third day. Noticed the way she nervously chewed her thumbnail when Mrs. Kowalski called on her in class. Noticed the intricate motorcycle sketches in the margins of her history notebook, detailed drawings of Harleys and Triumphs and old Indian chiefs that showed real skill. Noticed the way she looked out the window during fifth period with an expression that was equal parts longing and resignation, like she was trapped in a box and couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. The connection happened over a broken bicycle chain. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind of October day where the heat had finally broken just enough to make being outside tolerable. Eli was walking out of Henderson's Hardware at 4:30, his work apron still tied around his waist, a grease rag hanging from his back pocket. He was thinking about nothing in particular, running through the mental math of his paycheck and how much he could slip into his mother's tip jar without her noticing. Then he saw her, Fallon Kane, walking a beat-up Schwinn cruiser down Chester Avenue, the chain hanging loose and dragging on the pavement with a metallic scraping sound that made Eli wince. She was scowling at the bike like it had personally betrayed her, muttering something under her breath that probably wasn't fit for polite company. Eli didn't think about it. He just walked over, pulling the grease rag from his pocket. Chain came off. Fallon looked up, startled. Her hand moved instinctively to her jacket pocket, a defensive gesture that spoke volumes about the kind of caution her father had taught her. Then she saw it was just Eli, the quiet kid from history class, and some of the tension bled out of her shoulders. "Yeah, second time this week. Thing's a piece of junk. Master Link probably wore out." Eli knelt on the sidewalk, ignoring the grime and the heat radiating up from the concrete. "Happens when the chain gets old. You keep riding it like this, you'll strip the teeth off the sprocket." He pulled a small tool kit from his apron pocket. Old man Henderson let him keep it, one of the perks of the job. His hands moved with the unconscious competence of someone who'd spent hours fixing broken thing, threading the chain back onto the rear sprocket, checking the tension, replacing the worn master link with a fresh one from the store. 2 minutes. That's all it took. 2 minutes of focused work, his hands steady and sure, the world narrowing down to the simple problem of metal and mechanics and making something broken whole again. When he finished, he stood up and wiped his hands on the rag. Should hold for a while, but you're going to need a new chain soon. This one's stretched pretty bad. Fallon stared at him, not with suspicion or wariness, but with something that looked almost like wonder. You just fixed it, just like that. It wasn't that broken. Eli shrugged, suddenly awkward under the weight of her attention. Master Link's like $1.50. I've got a bunch at the store if you need one later. What do I owe you? Nothing. It's a master link. He started to walk away, already regretting the interaction, already retreating back into the comfortable invisibility that kept him safe. Wait, he turned back. Fallon was smiling, not a big smile, not some Hollywood beam of gratitude, just a small, genuine upturn of her mouth that made her whole face soften. You're Eli right from history. Yeah, I'm Fallon. I know. She walked her bike closer, testing the chain with a spin of the pedals. It ran smooth and quiet, the metallic scraping replaced with the soft clicking of a properly tensioned drive. You're the first person who's talked to me like I'm normal since I got here. You are normal. My dad rides with the Hells Angels. I know that too. Eli met her eyes. Doesn't change the fact that your bike chain was busted. Something shifted in that moment. Some invisible barrier that Fallon had been carrying dissolved just a little bit. She laughed quick and sharp, like she'd surprised herself. Fair enough. They walked together that afternoon. Not talking much, just existing in a shared silence that felt more comfortable than any conversation Eli had managed in months. Fallon pushed her bike. Eli walked with his hands in his pockets, and the October sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. The next day, she waited for him after school. The day after that, she was there again. By the end of the week, it was an established pattern. They'd walk the 6 blocks from school to Chester Avenue, together talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. The stray dog they'd started feeding behind the old auto body shop. The way Mrs. Kowalski always smelled like peppermint and chalk dust. The particular quality of light in Oildale at sunset, golden and forgiving in a way the harsh noon sun never was. Eli told her about the hardware store, about the satisfaction of organizing chaos, and the customers who came in knowing exactly what size bolt they needed. Fallon told him about motorcycles, about the feeling of riding behind her father on the Road King, with the wind tearing at her clothes and the world blurring into a river of speed and noise. They didn't talk about the hard things. Eli didn't mention his father's pocket watch or the way his mother cried sometimes when she thought he was asleep. Fallon didn't talk about why she transferred from San Bernardino or what it was like being the daughter of a man who wore violence like other people wore cologne. But the silence between them was never empty. It was full of understanding of 2 kids who'd learned early that the world was a hard place and the only way through was to keep moving. 2 weeks into their friendship, the violence had found them anyway. The first crack appeared at a dive bar off Highway 99, a place called Lucky's that was neither lucky nor particularly welcoming. It catered to the kind of men who worked with their hands and drank to forget a clientele that knew better than to cause trouble when the wrong people were present. Wade Harrow was not one of those people. He was 32 years old and looked 50, the kind of accelerated aging that came from cooking your brain with cheap methamphetamine and living like every day might be your last. Gaunt and twitchy with sunken eyes and a spiderweb of scars on his knuckles from fights he'd won and fights he'd lost. He led a small crew called the Vipers, though calling them a gang was generous. They were more like a collection of meth dealers and car thieves who occasionally worked together when the money was good and the risk was low. Wade had a chip on his shoulder the size of California and enough chemical courage to ignore the basic rules of survival. Rules like don't disrespect a fully patched member of the Hells Angels in his own territory. It happened on a Thursday night. Grady Kane was sitting at the bar nursing a beer and minding his own business, his leather cut draped over the back of his stool like a warning sign. He was alone, which was unusual. Most angels traveled in pairs or packs, but Grady had needed some air, some space to think about things that didn't involve club business or the weight of the death's head on his back. Wade stumbled into him, literally stumbled, high as a kite, and unsteady on his feet, bumping into Grady's shoulder hard enough to spill beer down the front of the older man's cut. Dark liquid splashed across the leather, soaking into the patches, dripping onto the floor. The bar went silent. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Every head turned to watch what would happen next because everyone in Lucky's knew this was a moment that would define the rest of Wade Harrow's very short life. Grady stood up slowly. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. He just stood there, all 6'4" of him, and looked down at Wade with the kind of calm that preceded volcanic eruptions. Wade, too high to read the room and too stupid to care, puffed out his chest. "Watch where you're sitting, old man." "Old man," Grady's voice was soft. "Dangerous. You spilled beer on my colors." "Colors?" Wade sneered, the word coming out slurred and mocking. "That's supposed to scare me. Bunch of weekend warriors playing dress-up on your little bikes." The punch came so fast that half the bar missed it. Grady's left fist a sledgehammer wrapped in leather and knuckles that had been breaking faces for 3 decades. It caught Wade square on the jaw with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The impact lifted Wade off his feet and dropped him onto the sawdust-covered floor, blood already pouring from his mouth. Grady knelt down beside him, grabbed Wade's collar, and lifted his head just enough to make eye contact. "That's for the disrespect. You ever touch my colors again, you ever say another word about my club, and I'll put you in the ground." "We clear." Wade couldn't answer. His jaw was broken in 3 places, wired shut by the time the ambulance got him to the emergency room. But his eyes said everything that needed saying. Hate, humiliation, the kind of festering rage that turns a stupid man into a dangerous one. Grady let him drop and walked out of Lucky's without looking back. The bartender cleaned up the blood without comment. The other patrons went back to their drinks. In Oildale, you learn not to see certain things. But Wade Harrow saw. Lying on that floor with his face swelling and his mouth full of blood and broken teeth, he made a decision. He couldn't touch Grady Kane directly. Touching a fully patched Hell's Angel was suicide, an invitation for the entire club to come down on you like the wrath of God. But there were other ways to hurt a man. Other softer targets. He'd seen Grady pick up a girl from school. Dark blonde ponytail, combat boots, the cautious way she climbed onto the back of that Road King. Daughter. Had to be. And if Wade couldn't break the man well, he could sure as hell break the man's heart. It took 2 weeks of surveillance. Wade wasn't smart, but he was patient when the chemicals in his system allowed for it. He watched Fallon's patterns, noted the time she left school, the route she took home. Olive Drive, that long stretch of abandoned industrial buildings and empty lots. Perfect. Isolated. The kind of place where screams didn't carry and witnesses were non-existent. He noted something else too. The skinny kid who always walked with her. Brown hair, forgettable face, probably a classmate. Wade didn't give him much thought. Collateral damage if he got in the way. A witness who'd need to be dealt with, but mostly just background noise. Wade gathered his crew. Gary, a skeletal man with a neck tattoo and a 1,000-yard stare. Travis, heavy and mean and not particularly bright. Luis, young and eager to prove himself. They met in the back room of a house on the east side, the kind of place where the carpet stuck to your shoes and the air smelled like chemical waste and desperation. Tuesday afternoon, Wade said, his voice still distorted from the wiring in his jaw. 4:30 when she's walking home. We grab her, make it quick, leave her somewhere, her daddy will find her. Send a message. You sure about this? Gary shifted nervously. That's Iron's kid. The Angels will burn this whole town down. They gotta catch us first. Wade's eyes were wild, gleaming with meth-fueled certainty. We do this right, we're 3 states away before they even know what happened. And Cain gets to live with knowing he couldn't protect his own blood. That's the message. Tuesday came with a cold front that dropped the temperature into the 50s and brought a bitter wind that smelled like distant rain. The sky was the color of old bruises, heavy clouds pressing down on Oildale like a threat. Eli and Fallon walked together like they had every day for the past 2 weeks. They were talking about the stray dog, arguing good-naturedly about what to name it. Fallon wanted to call it Wrench. Eli thought that was ridiculous and was lobbying for Scout. They didn't notice the rusted Chevy Impala creeping along 3 blocks behind them, headlights off engine barely audible over the wind. They were too caught up in the comfortable rhythm of friendship in the shared silence between words to notice the danger stalking them through the empty streets. Olive Drive stretched before them, a desolate corridor of closed auto body shops and vacant lots surrounded by chain link and razor wire. The perfect place to disappear. The worst place to be when predators were hunting. Eli was laughing, actually laughing, a rare, genuine sound that made Fallon's eyes light up with something close to joy. She just made a joke about Mrs. Kowalski's collection of erasers, something silly and pointless, and Eli had found it funnier than it probably was. Then the screech of worn brake pads shattered everything. The Impala swerved violently onto the sidewalk, cutting off their path. Doors kicked open before the car even fully stopped. 4 men spilled out, moving with the jerky, coordinated chaos of people who'd rehearsed this moment in their heads 100 times. Wade Harrow stepped forward first, his face still grotesquely swollen from Grady's punch, his jaw wired shut in a way that made his words come out wet and slurred. He pulled a heavy steel tire iron from his waistband, the metal catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Well, well, the words were barely intelligible through his wired teeth. Little biker princess, out for a walk. Fallon froze. Every instinct her father had taught her screamed danger, screamed run, but her feet wouldn't move. She knew these men, not personally, but she knew the type. The desperate, chemical-crazy edge in their eyes. The way they moved like pack animals circling wounded prey. Back off. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. My dad will kill you. All of you. You know what he'll do. Oh. Wade laughed, a horrible, wet, rattling sound. Daddy ain't here, little girl. And by the time he finds you, I'll be long gone. Grab her. 3 men lunged forward. Gary reached for Fallon's arm. Travis moved to flank her. Luis circled wide, cutting off escape routes. Eli didn't think. If he'd stopped to think, the sheer terror would have frozen him solid. He was 14 years old, weighed 112 pounds, had never thrown a punch in his life. There was no world in which this ended well for him. No scenario where he walked away from 4 grown men high on meth and rage, and the kind of violence that came easy to people with nothing to lose. But he didn't think. He remembered his father's pocket watch, those 6 words engraved on tarnished silver. Do what's right, not what's easy. He saw Fallon's face, saw the fear breaking through her carefully constructed armor, saw the girl who'd smiled at him over a bicycle chain and made him feel like maybe being invisible wasn't the only way to survive. His body moved before his brain caught up. Eli threw himself directly at the largest man, Travis, a human projectile launched from pure desperate instinct. The impact was brutal. His shoulder slammed into Travis's chest with enough force to knock the bigger man off balance, to buy Fallon maybe 2 seconds to run. Travis grabbed Eli by the collar of his jacket and hurled him into the chain-link fence. Metal rattled like thunder. Eli's head snapped back against the links, his vision exploding into white stars and nauseating darkness. Blood started running hot down the back of his neck, from where the fence had split his scalp. Run, Fallon. The words tore out of his throat, raw and desperate. Run. Fallon turned to sprint. Wade stepped into her path, raising the tire iron. Eli scrambled to his feet, legs shaking, and launched himself at Wade's knees. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and violence, the tire iron clattering away across the pavement. Wade was stronger, older, furious. He rained punches down on Eli's back and ribs, heavy closed-fist blows that drove the air from the boy's lungs. Something cracked, a rib snapping like dry wood. Pain exploded through Eli's chest, sharp and breathtaking and unlike anything he'd ever experienced. But he held on, wrapped his arms around Wade's legs in a death grip, refusing to let go, acting as a human anchor so Fallon could run. He could hear her footsteps, the slap of combat boots on asphalt, the sound of her running, and that was good. That was worth it. "Get off me, you little rat!" Wade kicked violently, his boot connecting with Eli's ribs. The cracked bone ground against itself, sending fresh waves of agony through his body. Two of the other men realized Fallon was getting away. They took off after her, leaving Travis to help Wade. Eli looked up through a haze of pain and blood dripping into his eyes. He saw them chasing her down the alley, saw her pulling away, but not fast enough, not quite fast enough. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like battery acid in his veins, Eli let go of Wade. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees and grabbed the ankle of the nearest man pursuing Fallon. The man tripped, face-planting hard onto the concrete with a sound that would have been satisfying if Eli had any capacity left for satisfaction. It bought her seconds. Precious, life-saving seconds. Fallon screamed for help, her voice echoing off the corrugated metal buildings bouncing through the empty industrial wasteland. But Eli had just signed his own death warrant. Wade got to his feet, breathing hard, eyes wide and completely unhinged. His hand went to his pocket. The sound that came next was small and terrible. The chilling snick of a switchblade deploying. 6 inches of serrated steel catching the dying afternoon light. "You want to play hero?" Wade's voice was a hiss through his wired jaw. "You want to die for some bikers, kid you barely know." Eli tried to crawl backward. His broken rib ground against his lung, making every breath a study in agony. He looked past Wade down the alley where Fallon was finally pulling out of reach, finally getting to safety. He'd done it. She was safe. Wade lunged. Eli threw his arms up to protect his face. The first strike tore through his forearm, the blade slicing deep into muscle and tendon. Blood sprayed hot and immediate. Eli cried out, dropping his guard. The second strike was an upward thrust, brutal and precise, driving the serrated blade into Eli's lower abdomen. The world stopped. Eli's eyes went wide. His breath left his body in a sudden, silent rush. He looked down, shocked, watching a dark stain spread across the front of his gray t-shirt with impossible speed. Wade's hand was still on the knife buried to the hilt in Eli's gut. Their eyes met. Wade's were wild and empty. Eli's were confused, already glazing over with shock. Wade yanked the blade out. Eli felt it leave his body, felt the warm rush of blood following the steel. He tried to stay standing. Failed. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto his back on the cold asphalt. "Hey, I see you. I'm calling the cops!" A voice shouted from a second-story window above them. Panic cut through Wade's chemical haze. Sirens. He could already hear them wailing in the distance, growing closer. "We gotta go. Move, now." The 4 men piled into the Impala. Tires squealed. The car tore away in a cloud of exhaust and burning rubber, leaving Eli alone in the gathering darkness. The cold from the asphalt seeped into his bones. The pain was beyond comprehension, a heavy burning fire radiating from his stomach and turning the edges of his vision fuzzy and gray. He tried to breathe, couldn't quite manage it. Something was wrong inside him, something vital and broken. Footsteps slapped against the pavement. Fallon threw herself onto the ground beside him, her hands flying immediately to the wound in his stomach, pressing down with all her might. Her hands were instantly covered in his blood, warm and sticky, and far too much of it. "Eli, oh my God, Eli, look at me. Keep your eyes open." She was sobbing hysterically, all that careful armor completely shattered. Tears fell from her face, mixing with the blood soaking his shirt. Eli blinked slowly. The sky was getting darker. He felt so tired. His whole body felt heavy, like he was sinking into the asphalt, becoming part of the street. He tried to speak, to tell her it was okay, to tell her she was safe, and that was all that mattered. All that came out was a wet, rattling cough. Blood on his lips. "Don't close your eyes, please." Fallon pressed harder, her entire body shaking with effort and fear. "You saved me. You saved me, Eli. Stay with me. Please stay with me. Eli managed a faint smile. His hand came up, trembling fingers brushing against the cuff of her denim jacket. A small gesture, a connection, a goodbye. Then his hand went limp, fell heavily to the cracked pavement. The ambulance arrived in a screaming blur of lights and sound. Paramedics swarmed professional and urgent, prying Fallon away from Eli's body. She fought them at first, not understanding, not wanting to let go of the boy who'd taken a knife meant for her. 14-year-old male, multiple stab wounds to the abdomen and forearm, massive hemorrhaging, blood pressure, bottoming out. The lead paramedic was already starting an IV line, shouting to his partner, "Get me 4 units ready. We're losing him." They loaded Eli onto a gurney and crashed through the ER doors of Bakersfield Memorial Hospital at speeds that would have been illegal in any other context. The trauma base swallowed him whole, a symphony of controlled chaos and barked orders, and the harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look too bright and too real. Fallon sat in the waiting room, wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, staring at nothing. Her hands, her favorite denim jacket, her jeans all stained deep, rusty brown with Eli's blood. The nurses tried to clean her up. She refused to move, refused to speak, just sat there trembling, replaying the moment over and over. The automatic doors slid open. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Security guards near the metal detector stood up straight, hands drifting toward their belts on pure instinct. The civilians in the waiting room suddenly found the floor very interesting. Grady Kane walked in. He was massive, 6'4" of raw power, in controlled violence, wearing heavy engineer boots, in grease-stained jeans, and that leather cut with its patches that commanded immediate terrified respect. The Death's Head skull seemed to stare at everyone and no one. The rockers reading Hell's Angels in San Bernardino might as well have been carved in stone and blood. His face was granite, unreadable. His eyes scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned early to identify threats in assess situations before most people even noticed there was a problem. Then he saw Fallon. Grady crossed the room in 3 massive strides and dropped to his knees in front of his daughter, ignoring the gasps from the bystanders. He took her small, blood-soaked hands in his huge, calloused ones. "Fallon," his voice was deep and rough, but remarkably gentle. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" Fallon broke. The shock started to wear her off, replaced by a tsunami of grief and guilt and horror. She threw her arms around her father's neck, burying her face in his leather vest, and sobbed like the 13-year-old girl she was underneath all that armor. "It wasn't me, Daddy. It was Eli. They came for me. Wade Harrow and his crew. They wanted to hurt me, to hurt you, but Eli—" Her voice broke. "He fought them. He wouldn't let them touch me. He took the knife. There was so much blood." Grady's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He knew exactly who Wade Harrow was. The tweaker he'd put on the floor at Lucky's 2 weeks ago. The man had just made the last mistake of his very short life. But that wasn't the priority. Not right now. "Where's the boy?" Grady asked quietly. "Surgery. They rushed him into surgery." Fallon pulled back, looking at her father with red, swollen eyes. "Daddy, he knew they were coming for me. He could have run. He chose to stand in front of me. He took the knife so I could get away." Grady closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. In the world he'd lived in for 28 years, loyalty and sacrifice were the highest forms of currency. Brothers took bullets for brothers. Men stood in front of blades for their club. It was expected. It was the code. But a 14-year-old civilian boy taking a knife for a Hell's Angels daughter, that was something else entirely. That was sacred. Grady stood up. He kissed the top of Fallon's head. "Stay right here. He's going to make it. I promise you." He walked out of the sliding doors into the freezing November night. The hospital parking lot was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lights. Grady walked to the edge of the lot, pulling a heavy phone from his jacket pocket. He didn't call the police. The police were for civilians. Grady dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was gruff, tired, but immediately alert. Callan Reaper Frost, president of the Bakersfield Charter. Callan, it's ironclad. What's wrong, brother? Callan knew that tone, had heard it before in prison yards and dive bars and situations that required the kind of response that left bodies in shallow graves. Wade Harrow made a move on my daughter today, cornered her on Olive Drive. Silence on the line, then the sound of a chair scraping back. Is she untouched? Grady's voice dropped an octave, carrying a weight that made strong men nervous. But she was walking with a civilian kid, 14 years old. The boy fought off 4 of them, took 2 blades to the gut to give my daughter time to run. He's on a table right now fighting for his life. Callan exhaled slowly. A civilian kid took a blade for the patch. He took a blade for my blood. Grady's words were carved from ice and iron, which means he took it for the club. I want Harrow. I want everyone who was with him. And I want this hospital locked down. Nobody gets near this kid but doctors and us. Consider it done. Callan's voice shifted from friend to commander. Give me 10 minutes. Grady hung up. He stood in the cold air, looking up at the stars barely visible through the valley's perpetual haze, and made a silent vow that would echo across California. Across the state, phones started ringing. In Fresno, a pool game stopped mid-shot. Men in leather vests set down their cues, their faces hardening as the message was relayed. In Oakland, a mechanic rolled out from under a vintage panhead, wiped grease from his hands, and went inside to grab the go-bag he kept ready for nights like this. In Los Angeles, men kissed their sleeping wives, strapped heavy knives to their belts, and walked out into the darkness. The calls cascaded through the network. Bakersfield to San Bernardino up through the Central Valley to the Bay Area. Each call carried the same message, sanctioned by the highest-ranking officers on the West Coast. A civilian boy had bled for one of their own. The club owed a blood debt, and the Hells Angels did not leave debts unpaid. Within 30 minutes, the night started to change. It began as a low, distant hum, like a swarm of angry hornets gathering for war. Then it grew. From every highway, every back road, every interstate converging on Bakersfield, the sound multiplied. The distinct, thunderous roar of heavily modified V-twin engines. Open pipes that turned internal combustion into a war cry. Chrome and steel and power rolling through the California night like mechanized cavalry. They rode in tight, disciplined formations. 10 bikes, 50 bikes, 100 bikes. By 2 in the morning, Highway 99 was burning under the tires of the convoy. They cut through fog like the wrath of Old Testament angels, leather and denim, and patches that told stories most people were better off not knowing. They were men who'd ridden with legends, men who'd survived prison riots and gang wars, and decades of living by a code that valued loyalty above life itself. There were young prospects eager to prove their worth, and old road warriors who'd seen it all and were still ready to ride to war for a brother in need. They wore their colors proudly. The Death's Head skulls caught the glare of highway lights. The bottom rockers, San Bernardino, Fresno, Oakland, Vallejo, Los Angeles, formed a map of mobilized brotherhood that stretched across the entire state. Back at the hospital, Grady sat beside his sleeping daughter, watching the doors to the surgical ward. Outside, the ground began to tremble. The windows in the lobby vibrated softly in their frames. Nurses at the front desk looked at each other in confusion. The low rumble grew into an absolute deafening roar that seemed to swallow the entire hospital complex. 200 Harley-Davidsons rolled into Bakersfield Memorial Hospital, and they were bringing a reckoning that the San Joaquin Valley would remember for generations. The Bakersfield Memorial Hospital parking lot was never designed to hold an army, but that's exactly what it became in the dead hours before dawn. The low, vibrating hum that had rattled the reinforced glass doors crescendoed into something that felt less like sound and more like an earthquake with a purpose. 200 Harley-Davidsons, their chrome exhausts gleaming under the sickly yellow streetlights, rolled into the circular driveway and the adjacent lots in a formation that would have made military commanders jealous. They didn't arrive in chaos. These weren't weekend warriors or cosplay outlaws. They rode in staggered columns, each bike precisely positioned, engines synchronized in a way that turned mechanical noise into something that felt almost orchestral. The lead riders killed their engines simultaneously. The sudden silence fell like an iron curtain, heavy and absolute. Inside the emergency room lobby, panic rippled through the late-night skeleton crew. The triage nurse's hands froze over her keyboard. A young security guard, maybe 6 months out of training, reached instinctively for his radio, with fingers that had gone pale and trembling. "Dispatch, we have a situation at Memorial." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "We've got, I don't even know how many. Hundreds of bikers. They're surrounding the building." Within 3 minutes, 4 Bakersfield Police Department cruisers screamed down Mount Vernon Avenue, their light bars painting the surrounding buildings in frantic strobing red and blue. The lead officer, a 20-year veteran named Jim Calloway, threw his cruiser into park and stepped out with his hand resting on his service weapon. Then he stopped dead. The bikers had not drawn weapons. They weren't shouting or threatening or doing anything that could be classified as an immediate threat. They simply stood in formation, an impenetrable wall of leather and denim and heavy boots forming a massive perimeter around the hospital's main entrance, the ambulance bay, and the entire trauma wing. It was the discipline that made Jim's blood run cold. This wasn't a mob. This was an organized force with a clear objective and the coordination to execute it. The patches on their backs told a story that made his hand drift away from his weapon because pulling it would be worse than useless. San Bernardino, Fresno, Oakland, Vallejo, Los Angeles, Stockton. Every major charter in Northern and Central California had sent riders. A figure separated himself from the front line and walked toward Jim with the kind of unhurried confidence that came from knowing you held every card in the deck. Callan Reaper Frost was a man who looked like he'd been carved from a redwood and then aged in violence and diesel smoke. His graying beard reached his collarbone. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes despite the midnight hour, which somehow made him more intimidating rather than less. "Evening, officer." Callan's voice was a rumble that carried over the crackle of police radios and the distant hum of idling engines. Callan. Jim knew him. Every cop in Kern County knew him. "What the hell is this? You can't occupy a county hospital. I've got riot units on standby and a SWAT team that can be here in 15 minutes. "Nobody's occupying anything, Jim." Callan held his hands out, palms open, a gesture that managed to be both peaceful and vaguely threatening. "We're not blocking the ambulance. We're not harassing the medical staff. If a civilian needs to get in, our boys will part like the Red Sea and hold the door for them." "Then why are you here?" Callan's face hardened, the polite veneer stripping away to reveal something older and more primal underneath. "Because there's a 14-year-old boy bleeding out on an operating table in there. He took a knife meant for the daughter of one of our fully patched brothers. That makes him family. And until we know that boy breathes on his own, this hospital is under our protection. Nobody gets in who shouldn't be here." Jim looked at the wall of 200 men. He did the math. Riot units would turn this into a bloodbath. SWAT would turn it into a war zone. And for what? These men weren't threatening anyone. They were just standing there, waiting, watching. "Keep them outside, Callan." Jim finally stepped back, making a decision that would probably cost him some sleep, but save a lot of lives. "One toe out of line and I call in the state troopers." "Appreciate the courtesy, officer." Callan nodded, once sharp and military. Then he turned and walked back to his position, and the wall of leather closed ranks behind him. Inside the hospital, the surgical waiting room had transformed into something that felt less like a medical facility and more like a vigil. Grady Kane sat like a statue carved from granite, his massive frame occupying a plastic chair that groaned under his weight. Fallon was curled against his side, finally to sleep after hours of trembling and tears wrapped in his leather cut like it was a blanket that could shield her from the world. The blood on her jeans had dried to a rust-colored crust. The nurses had tried 3 times to get her to change into hospital scrubs. She'd refused each time with a violence that made it clear the subject was closed. That blood belonged to the boy who'd saved her life. She wasn't washing it away like it meant nothing. Grady stroked his daughter's hair with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who'd only seen him in the context of bar fights and prison yards. His eyes never left the double doors that led to the operating theaters. Somewhere beyond those doors, a boy he'd never met was fighting a battle that Grady couldn't help him win. The doors finally pushed open just after 3 in the morning. Dr. Marcus Brennan walked out looking like he'd aged a decade in the last 4 hours. His surgical scrubs were spattered with blood that had soaked through in places. Dark circles hung under his eyes like bruises. He pulled off his surgical cap with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. The waiting room, which had been quietly filling with angels who'd come in from the parking lot in shifts, went absolutely silent. Grady stood up carefully, laying Fallon down on the plastic chairs without waking her. He crossed the room to meet the doctor halfway. "I'm Grady Kane. How is he?" Dr. Brennan looked at the towering biker with apprehension and bone-deep weariness. He'd been working in this hospital for 15 years. He'd seen gang violence, domestic disputes, industrial accidents. But he'd never seen 200 bikers lay siege to his workplace over a 14-year-old kid. "Mr. Kane," the doctor's voice was hoarse from hours of barking orders in the OR. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It was bad. The first wound to his forearm severed the radial artery. We repaired it, but he'd already lost significant blood volume before the paramedics got to him." Grady's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "The second wound was the critical one." Dr. Brennan continued, and something in his voice suggested he was still processing what he'd just spent 4 hours dealing with. The blade entered his lower abdomen at an upward angle. It missed his abdominal aorta by less than 2 millimeters. If it had clipped that artery, he would have bled to death on that sidewalk before anyone even called 911. A muscle jumped in Grady's cheek. 2 millimeters. The width of a pencil led between life and death. "The blade caused massive trauma to his spleen," the doctor went on. "We had to remove it entirely. It also perforated his bowel in 2 places, which means we're looking at a significant infection risk. He went into cardiac arrest twice on the table. We pumped 4 units of blood into him just to keep him stable enough to close. But he's alive." It wasn't a question. Grady needed to hear it said. "He's alive." Dr. Brennan nodded slowly. "We've placed him in a medically induced coma to give his body a chance to handle the shock and start the healing process. The next 48 hours are critical. If sepsis sets in, if his remaining organs start to fail, if his body can't handle the trauma," he didn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to." "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated. "ICU protocol is family only." Grady just looked at him, didn't argue, didn't threaten, just stood there with that quiet intensity that made it clear he wasn't leaving without seeing the boy who'd taken a knife for his daughter. Dr. Brennan sighed. "Through the glass in the intensive care unit, and no crowding, I mean it." 10 minutes later, Grady stood outside the glass wall that separated the ICU from the rest of the world. The intensive care unit was a realm of beeping machines and hushed urgency where every breath was monitored and every heartbeat measured against the possibility of failure. Eli looked impossibly small. His skin was translucent against the white hospital sheets, so pale he almost disappeared into the bedding. Tubes ran down his throat connected to a ventilator that breathed for him with mechanical precision. IV lines snaked into both arms. Monitors tracked his vitals in green and blue waves that looked fragile and uncertain. Grady had seen a lot of damaged people in his life. Men who'd been shot, stabbed, beaten within inches of their existence. He'd visited brothers in hospitals, in prison infirmaries, and once in a veterinary clinic when that was the only place that would treat a bullet wound without calling the cops. But there was something about seeing a 14-year-old boy hooked up to machines that made his chest feel tight in a way that violence never had. This kid hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't been born into the life or signed up for the code. He'd just been walking a girl home and made a split-second decision that most grown men wouldn't have the courage to make. Callan walked up quietly beside him, resting a heavy hand on Grady's shoulder. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of Eli's chest as the machine forced air into his damaged lungs. "He's got a lion's heart, this kid," Callan murmured. "He's a civilian, Callan." Grady's voice was thick with something that might have been grief or rage or both twisted together. "He shouldn't have had to be a lion." He turned away from the glass, and the sorrow transmuted instantly into something cold and calculated. "Have we found Wade Harrow?" Callan's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. "Axel's got eyes on every highway out of the valley. We've got people watching the meth houses, chop shops, every dive bar from here to Fresno. Harrow's a rat brother, and right now he's trapped in a very small cage." Grady cracked his knuckles. The sound was sharp as a gunshot in the quiet hallway. "Find him. I don't care what it takes." Inside the ICU, Eli Dalton drifted in darkness that felt thick as crude oil and twice as suffocating. He wasn't awake, wasn't quite unconscious either. He existed in that terrible in-between space where the brain tries to process trauma it has no framework to understand. The dreams came in fragments, disjointed, terrifying. The screech of brakes, the Impala cutting off his path, Wade's face grotesque and swollen, pulling that tire iron from his waistband. The moment of decision, his body throwing itself forward before his mind could catalog all the reasons that was suicide. The impacts, fists like hammers, his head snapping back against my chain link, the world spinning into nauseating chaos. The knife, that horrible snicking sound as the blade deployed, 6 inches of serrated steel catching the light. Wade's eyes wild and empty and completely disconnected from anything resembling human empathy. Then the blade entering his body. Eli relived it over and over in the morphine-soaked darkness of his induced coma. The shock of penetration, the strange cold hot sensation of steel parting flesh, the way his breath had left him in a rush like someone had opened a valve in his chest. He kept trying to change it. In the dream logic of sedated trauma, he kept thinking if he could just move a little faster, dodge a little better, be a little stronger, he could stop the blade from ever touching him. But it always ended the same way. The knife, the blood, the terrible realization that he was dying on a sidewalk in Oildale, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Voices filtered through sometimes. His mother, though he couldn't make out the words. Just the tone, desperate, broken. The sound of Nora Dalton trying not to fall apart in front of her dying son. Fallon's voice came through clearer. She was reading something, a book. The words didn't matter, but the sound of her voice was an anchor in the darkness, something familiar and safe that told him he wasn't alone. Then there was another voice, deep, unfamiliar. A man speaking quietly, words Eli couldn't quite catch, but the timbre resonated through the fog. Strong, steady, the kind of voice that sounded like it had seen terrible things and survived them all. Time lost meaning. Hours could have been days. Days could have been minutes. Eli floated in chemical twilight, his body doing the hard work of knitting itself back together, while his mind tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Nora Dalton arrived at Bakersfield Memorial at 3:14 in the morning, still wearing her waitress uniform from Millie's Diner. The smell of fryer grease and coffee clung to her like a shroud. Her hands were raw and red from scrubbing dishes, and her feet ached from a double shift that had stretched into something closer to 18 hours. None of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the phone call from the hospital telling her that her son had been stabbed and was in emergency surgery, and she needed to get there right now. She'd sprinted the 6 blocks from the diner because she didn't own a car and couldn't afford the cab fare. By the time she hit the hospital entrance, she was gasping for breath, and her vision was swimming with tears and exhaustion and the kind of terror that only parents know. The automatic doors opened, and she ran straight into a wall of leather and denim. 3 massive men in Hell's Angels cuts blocked the entrance, their faces impassive behind beards and sunglasses at 3 in the morning. Nora didn't even slow down. She tried to push past them, operating on pure maternal instinct and panic. My son's in there." I have to. The wall parted immediately. One of the men, older with a scar running through his left eyebrow, actually took off his sunglasses and looked at her with something approaching gentleness. You're Eli's mother. Yes. Where is he? Is he? She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the possibility that her boy was already gone. He's in surgery, ma'am. The biker gestured toward the entrance. Callan's waiting for you inside. He'll take you to where you need to be. Nora didn't question it, didn't ask why the Hells Angels were here or why they knew her son's name. She just ran. Callan met her in the lobby. Somehow this massive, terrifying man with death's head patches on his back managed to project calm authority and something almost protective. He escorted her through the hospital corridors past nurses who looked at the biker with wide eyes but didn't dare comment straight to where Grady stood outside the ICU. Grady turned as they approached. He saw a woman who looked like she'd been running on fumes for years and had finally hit empty, small, worn, desperate. He recognized the look, had seen it on his own mother's face more times than he cared to remember. Mrs. Dalton. He stepped forward, and despite his size and the patches on his cut, he moved with careful deliberation, making himself less threatening. I'm Grady Kane. Nora stared at him, processing, connecting dots. You're Fallon's father. Yes, ma'am. Where is my son? What happened? They said he was stabbed, but nobody would tell me. The words tumbled out in a rush, her voice climbing toward hysteria. Grady held up one hand and somehow the gesture was calming rather than silencing. Your boy is out of surgery. He's stable. He's in a medically induced coma to help his body handle the trauma. Can I see him? Through the glass. They're not letting anyone into the ICU yet. Grady led her to the observation window. Nora pressed her palms against the glass, staring at the small figure in the bed surrounded by machines. A sound came out of her that was less than a scream and more than a see, something primal and broken. My baby. Oh God, my baby. Mrs. Dalton. Grady's voice was quiet but firm. I need to tell you what happened, what your son did. Through tears, Nora listened as Grady explained. The attack, Wade Harrow and his crew cornering Fallon on Olive Drive. Eli throwing himself into the fight despite being outnumbered and outweighed, taking the knife so Fallon could run. He didn't hesitate, Grady said, and there was something like awe in his voice. 4 grown men high on meth, armed and violent, and your 14-year-old boy stood in front of them and fought. He took 2 blades and held them off long enough for my daughter to get to safety. Nora's knees gave out. Grady caught her before she hit the floor, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her to a chair. She buried her face in her hands and wept, her whole body shaking with the force of it. Why? She gasped between sobs. Why would he do that? He's never been in a fight in his life. He's not violent. He's not brave, Grady finished quietly. Mrs. Dalton, your son has more courage in his bones than most men I've ridden with for decades. He saw someone who needed help, and he helped. That's not common. That's rare. Nora looked up at him, this terrifying man with his patches and his scars and his reputation. They were after your daughter because of you, because of who you are. Yes, Grady didn't flinch from it, didn't make excuses. Wade Harrow wanted to hurt me. He couldn't touch me directly, so he went after Fallon. Your son got caught in the middle of club business that had nothing to do with him. And now Nora gestured helplessly at the ICU window. And now he's under the protection of every Hell's Angel on the West Coast. Grady's voice carried absolute certainty. Those men outside, they didn't come here because I called in favors. They came because word spread that a civilian kid took a knife for one of our own. That means something in our world. It means everything. Nora stared at him, trying to understand this code, this brotherhood, this violent world her son had accidentally stumbled into by virtue of being a good kid who tried to help people. Fallon appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. She looked small and young and haunted, her clothes still stiff with Eli's dried blood. When she saw Nora, she froze. "Mrs. Dalton," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't—" Nora stood up, crossed the room, and pulled Fallon into a fierce hug that made the girl gasp with surprise. "This is not your fault. Do you hear me? You didn't stab my son. You didn't attack him. Evil men did that." Fallon broke down crying against Nora's shoulder, and for a moment they held each other, two people connected by the boy fighting for his life on the other side of the glass. The first 48 hours were a study in controlled medical crisis. Eli's body, young and resilient, but catastrophically damaged, waged war against infection and shock, and the fundamental trauma of having vital organs removed and others repaired. His fever spiked on the second night. The nurses packed ice around him, cold compresses on his forehead and neck and under his arms, trying to bring his temperature down from the dangerous heights it had climbed to. The monitors tracking his vitals started chirping with increasing frequency, a staccato alarm that set every medical professional in the ICU on edge. Dr. Brennan studied the charts with growing concern. White blood cell count is climbing. The bowel perforation, we cleaned it as thoroughly as we could, but the risk of peritonitis is extreme. We're hitting him with broad-spectrum antibiotics, but his immune system is compromised from the trauma and blood loss. Nora sat in the ICU waiting area with Fallon, the two of them having formed an unlikely bond over the past day and a half. Grady came and went, splitting his time between watching over his daughter and coordinating with the angels outside. The hospital had become accustomed to the presence of bikers in the parking lot, the steady rotation of men who stood watch in shifts with military precision. At 4 in the morning on the second day, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor shifted into something rapid and erratic. Then it became a high-pitched alarm that brought nurses running. Eli's back arched slightly off the mattress. His chest heaved against the ventilator tube. The numbers on the screen flashed violent red. His blood pressure was plummeting. "Code blue, ICU room 4. A nurse slammed the emergency button on the wall, her voice cutting through the nighttime quiet like a blade. Chaos erupted in controlled medical fury. Dr. Brennan and a respiratory therapist burst through the door. A crash cart materialized from somewhere, wheels squealing on the polished floor. "He's crashing!" Dr. Brennan barked, grabbing a syringe. "Septic shock. Blood pressure's bottoming out. Push epinephrine. Get the defibrillator ready." In the waiting area, Nora heard the commotion, heard her son's room number. She was on her feet and running before conscious thought kicked in, but Grady was faster. He wrapped his arms around her, not restraining, but holding, keeping her from bursting into a room where she couldn't help and would only be in the way. "No, let me go. That's my son," Nora screamed, fighting against Grady's hold with a mother's desperate strength. Fallon pressed against her father's back, trembling violently, unable to watch and unable to look away. Through the glass, they could see the medical team swarming Eli's bed, hands moving in practice coordination. Syringes, IV lines, the defibrillator paddles being charged with a rising whine that sounded like a scream building an electronic throat. "Clear," Dr. Brennan shouted. Eli's small body jolted violently as 200 joules of electricity ripped through his chest. The monitor remained unchanged, a flat line, a tone that seemed to go on forever. Grady closed his eyes, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Behind him in the hallway, a dozen angels had stood up from their vigil positions. The air grew thick with tension and helpless rage. "Again! Charged to 200? Dr. Brennan's voice had taken on a desperate edge. "Clear." Another jolt, another spasm. Nora sobbed into Grady's chest, the sound muffled and broken. Fallon was crying, two silent tears streaming down her face as she watched the boy who'd saved her fight a battle none of them could help him win. 3 seconds of silence, the kind of silence that feels like the end of the world. Then a single staggered beep from the monitor, faint, uncertain. Then another, the jagged green line slowly returning, finding a weak but steady rhythm. "We have a pulse." The lead nurse exhaled, her knees practically buckling with relief. "Pressure is stabilizing. He's fighting back." Dr. Brennan slumped against the wall, pulling down his mask. Sweat dripped from his forehead. He looked at Nora through the glass and nodded slowly. He's back. The fever's breaking. Your son's still fighting. In the darkness of his induced coma, Eli felt himself being pulled away from something warm and final. A part of him had been ready to let go, ready to stop fighting. The pain was so immense and the exhaustion so complete that surrendering felt like mercy. But he heard voices, his mother crying his name, Fallon reading to him, her voice thick with tears, and that other voice, the deep, unfamiliar one, saying words he couldn't quite make out, but that carried weight and certainty. Somewhere in the chemical twilight, Eli made a choice. Not a conscious decision, so much as a fundamental refusal to quit. His father's watch, even though it was in a plastic bag with his bloody clothes somewhere in the hospital's storage, seemed to whisper those engraved words, "Do what's right, not what's easy." Giving up was easy. Fighting was right. His heart beat, and beat again, and kept beating out of pure stubborn will. The crisis passed, slowly. The fever came down degree by careful degree. The antibiotics started winning the war against infection. Eli's vital signs stabilized into something the doctors cautiously described as encouraging. 70 miles away in a rusted-out single-wide trailer in the industrial wasteland, locals called the Boneyard Wade Harrow, was learning what real fear tasted like. The trailer sat in a graveyard of abandoned RVs and forgotten lives, a stretch of barren dirt where broken-down vehicles went to decay and people went to disappear. The only light came from a neon liquor store sign 3 blocks over, bleeding, sickly red through the cracked blinds and irregular pulses. Wade paced the stained linoleum floor like a caged animal, his movements jerky and paranoid. The meth was wearing off, leaving behind the kind of gnawing anxiety that made skin crawl and minds fracture. His 3 crew members, Gary, Travis, and Luis, were in various states of panic. Gary stood at the window, peering through a tear in the curtains with eyes that hadn't blinked in what felt like hours. His spiderweb neck tattoo seemed to pulse with his racing heartbeat. "We gotta run, Wade. We gotta get the hell out of California. You didn't say the kid was walking with Kowalski's daughter. You didn't say we were touching club business." "Shut up," Wade snapped, his voice still distorted from the wiring in his jaw. "The kid jumped in. I didn't plan for the kid." "It doesn't matter what you planned." Travis's bulk filled the narrow hallway. He was sweating despite the cold his shirt soaked through. "My cousin drives a tow truck off the 99. He called me on a burner. Says the angels are here. All of them. San Bernardino, Oakland, Fresno, LA. They got the hospital locked down and sentries sitting at every on-ramp out of town. We're marked," Luis whispered from where he sat in the corner, knees pulled up to his chest. "They greenlit us, Wade. You know what that means. The cops will arrest us. The angels will do worse." Wade ran filthy hands through his greasy hair. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. In his chemically ravaged brain, he thought he was making a statement, proving that the Vipers were a force to be reckoned with, that Wade Harrow wasn't some punk to be humiliated in a bar and then forgotten. Instead, he'd kicked open the gates of hell. "We take the oil field roads," Wade muttered, his eyes wide and manic. "The Kern River Basin. There's hundreds of miles of access roads out there that don't show up on any GPS. We take the Impala, kill the headlights, drive through the derricks until we hit the desert. Once we're in Nevada, we're ghosts." It was a desperate plan, a stupid plan, born of pure terror and chemical imbalance, in the cornered rat's certainty that staying in Bakersfield meant death. What Wade didn't know was that the Hells Angels didn't rely on police scanners or GPS or any kind of technology the law could track. They relied on something far more effective, a network of loyalty that stretched deeper than law enforcement could ever hope to penetrate. They were the men who drove the supply trucks and fixed the rigs, the mechanics who worked on fleet vehicles, and the bartenders who poured drinks and remembered faces, the security guards and sanitation workers and tow truck operators, working-class men who respected the code and understood that the angels took care of their own. In a dimly lit auto body shop on the east side, a grizzled biker named Axel Thorne leaned against the fender of a partially disassembled Nova. Axel wore the filthy few patch, a designation that carried weight in terrifying rumors. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette when his phone buzzed. Yeah, Axel. It's Hector from the overnight sanitation crew. The voice on the other end was hushed nervous. I'm doing my route near the Boneyard Trailer Park off Roberts Lane. I just saw that rusted '98 Impala you guys put the word out for, tucked behind a burned-out Winnebago. 4 guys just piled into it. They look spooked. Axel smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Which way they heading? Turn north, toward the old oil field access roads. Good looking out, Hector. Club owes you one. Axel ended the call and keyed the radio clip to his vest. Callan, it's Axel. Got a rabbit running north into the Kern River derricks. I'm taking 10 riders. We're going to flush them out. Callan's voice crackled back through static. Copy that. Ironclad wants to be there when the music stops. Box them in. Don't let them reach the desert. Within minutes, the silent California night shattered under the roar of V-twin engines. The Kern River oil field was a dystopian landscape of nodding pump jacks stretching as far as the eye could see. Thousands of them, their mechanical heads rising and falling in endless rhythm like skeletal birds drinking from the earth. The dirt roads between them were a maze of deep ruts, blind corners, and steep ravines that could swallow a vehicle whole if the driver wasn't careful. Wade was behind the wheel of the Impala, driving by moonlight with the headlights off. The car's suspension groaned and bottomed out violently as they hit the rutted tracks at 50 miles per hour. Dust billowed inside the cabin, choking them, turning every breath into a struggle. We're gonna make it, Wade chanted to himself, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Hit the foothills. Cross into Nevada. Gone. We're gone. Then he looked in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a single beam of light piercing through the thick cloud of dust they were kicking up. Then another light appeared beside it, and another. The low rumble of motorcycle engines began to vibrate through the floorboards of the Impala, a sound that felt less like mechanics and more like approaching thunder. The bikes weren't just behind them. As Wade slammed the brakes to take a sharp turn around a massive storage tank, 3 more headlights flared to life directly in front of him, blocking the narrow road. Oh, God. Gary whimpered from the bush seat, curling into a fetal position. They found us. They're here. Hold on, Wade screamed, throwing the car into reverse. The tires spun furiously, spitting gravel and dirt, the car fishtailing wildly. He managed to turn the vehicle down a secondary access road, his foot slamming the accelerator to the floor. But motorcycles were infinitely more agile than a 26-year-old Impala with bad suspension and bald tires. The bikers didn't just chase the car, they hunted it. Rode parallel, flanking it from both sides, hurting it exactly where they wanted it to go. The thunder of engines was deafening, echoing off the metal oil tanks and the pump jack frames. It was psychological warfare designed to break Wade's mind before they ever laid a hand on him. A biker pulled up alongside Wade's window, close enough that Wade could see the skull patch on his chest in the ambient moonlight. The rider raised a heavy steel chain in his right hand and brought it down against the Impala's side mirror. Glass exploded. Metal shrieked. Wade screamed, jerking the wheel. The car careened off the dirt path, crashed through a rusted chain-link fence, and went airborne for one terrifying second before slamming down hard in the center of an abandoned industrial scrapyard. The front axle snapped with a sickening crunch. The engine hissed and died, white steam erupting from the crumpled hood in a geyser of failure. They were trapped. Dust slowly settled over the scrapyard, illuminated by the harsh glare of 20 motorcycle headlights, forming a perfect semicircle around the dead Impala. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. The bikers didn't rev their engines, didn't shout. They simply parked their bikes, deployed kickstands in perfect unison, and dismounted. The terrifying reality crashed down on Wade Harrow with the weight of a collapsing building. He was sitting in a broken car, surrounded by 20 of the most dangerous men in California, in a place where nobody could hear him scream. Footsteps crunched on gravel, The bikers parted, creating a pathway through their ranks. Grady Kane walked through. He'd taken off his leather cut, wearing only a black t-shirt that showed the full canvas of tattoos covering his arms. He carried no weapon. His face was entirely devoid of anger, replaced by something far more terrifying, a cold, calculating vacancy. The face of a man who'd already made his decision and was simply following through. "Get out of the car, Wade." Grady's voice boomed across the scrapyard, echoing off rusted metal husks. Inside the Impala, the air was thick with panic and the sour smell of fierce sweat. Travis, the heavy-set man in the passenger seat, was openly weeping. "I ain't dying for you, Wade. I told you not to touch the girl." Wade's hands shook as he reached under his seat. His fingers brushed cold steel. A cheap .38 caliber revolver he'd bought out of a trunk in Fresno. It only had 4 bullets. There were 20 bikers out there. He knew the math, but the cornered animal part of his brain took over anyway. "Get out of the car, Wade." Grady repeated, his boots stopping 5 feet from the driver's door. Wade kicked the door open and stumbled out, raising the trembling revolver, pointing it at Grady's chest. "Stay back," his voice cracked, spittle flying. "I'll kill you. I'll put a hole right through you, Kane." Not a single biker flinched. Not one reached for a weapon. They just stared at Wade with cold, dead eyes that had seen worse than a tweaker with a Saturday night special. Grady took a step forward. "You stabbed a 14-year-old boy, Wade." His voice was soft, conversational. Somehow that made it infinitely more terrifying. "Left a kid to bleed out in a gutter because you were too much of a coward to face me." "He got in the way," Wade shrieked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It wasn't supposed to." "You don't get to make excuses." Grady took another step. He was close now, close enough that Wade could smell hospital antiseptic and coffee on him. Close enough to see that Grady's eyes held no fear, only certainty. "You think a bullet stops what's coming for you." The passenger door flew open. Travis scrambled out, eyes wild with self-preservation panic. He looked at Wade holding a gun on a Hell's Angel and realized that if Wade pulled that trigger, everyone in the scrapyard was going to die screaming. Travis didn't run. He lunged at his own boss, tackling Wade from behind just as Wade's fingers started to squeeze. The gun went off. The crack echoed through the yard, but the bullet sailed harmlessly into the night sky. The 2 men crashed into the dirt wrestling. "Give me the gun, you idiot!" Travis screamed, punching Wade in the side of the head. "They're gonna kill us all." Wade, weakened by drugs and terror, couldn't fight back. Travis wrenched the revolver from his hand and hurled it far into the darkness of the scrapyard. Then he scrambled to his knees, throwing his hands in the air, looking at Grady with pleading, terrified eyes. "It wasn't me, I swear. He had the knife. Please, man, please." Grady looked down at Wade, who was curled in the dirt, gasping for breath, completely broken. Silence returned, heavier than before. Axel stepped forward, a heavy iron wrench in his hand. "Give the word ironclad. We dig a hole right here. Nobody ever finds them." Wade squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the crushing blow that would end his miserable existence. But Grady Kane was a father before he was a biker. He remembered holding Fallon in the hospital, her hands covered in Eli Dalton's blood. He remembered the frail rise and fall of that boy's chest connected to machines. He remembered what real courage looked like, and it wasn't this pathetic creature whimpering in the dirt. "No, dear." Grady's voice cut through the expectations, through the code, through everything the bikers had assumed would happen next. A murmur rippled through the assembled men. This was a violation of the unwritten rules. Blood demanded blood. Always had. Always would. Grady knelt in the dirt, grabbing Wade by the collar and hauling him up so they were eye to eye. Wade whimpered a pathetic, broken sound. "Killing you is a mercy you haven't earned." Grady's voice was a low rumble that vibrated into Wade's soul. "If we bury you out here, it's over in 5 minutes. You don't feel a thing after the first minute. That's too easy." He threw Wade back into the dirt in disgust, then stood and turned to Callan. "Call the cops. Tell them exactly where he is. Tell them we found the man who stabbed the kid." Callan raised an eyebrow, genuine surprise crossing his scarred face. You want to hand him to the law? The law's going to put him in Corcoran State Prison. Grady's voice carried to every man in the yard. He looked back down at Wade and his eyes burned with cold fire. And Wade knows exactly who runs the yards in Corcoran. The Aryan Brotherhood won't protect you. The cartels won't protect you. I'm putting the word out to every shot caller inside those walls. When you walk onto that cell block, you belong to us. Wade's eyes went wide with pure horror. He suddenly understood. Death in this scrapyard would have been a mercy, a few seconds of terror, and then nothing. What Grady was condemning him to was years, potentially decades of paranoid torture. Every shadow in prison would be a potential executioner. Every footstep on the tier a threat. Every meal suspect. Every shower dangerous. He would never sleep soundly again. Never be safe. Never know peace. No! Wade crawled toward Grady's boots, all pride abandoned. Please kill me. Just do it now, please. Grady ignored him, turning his back on the broken man and walking toward his road king. The message was clear. The punishment was worse than death. It was a master class in psychological destruction. 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens cut through the night. The Hells Angels didn't scatter. They calmly mounted their bikes, fired up their engines, and rode out of the scrapyard in a disciplined column, passing the incoming police cruisers without a backward glance. They had delivered their justice. Now they had a boy to watch over. Dawn broke over Bakersfield not with gentle warmth, but with a cold, unforgiving gray light that washed the color from the world. The fog rolling off the San Joaquin Valley clung to the pavement like something alive and reluctant to release its grip. Outside Bakersfield Memorial Hospital, the army of 200 men remained absolutely immovable. They had not slept, had barely spoken. They simply stood, watch a silent testament to a vow that would not be broken until the boy behind those walls opened his eyes. Nurses arriving for the morning shift walked through the sea of leather and chrome with expressions that had moved from fear to something approaching respect. These men hadn't threatened anyone, hadn't caused trouble. They'd held doors open for elderly patients, directed lost visitors to the right departments, and maintained a perimeter that somehow made everyone inside the hospital feel safer rather than threatened. Inside the intensive care unit waiting area, a new normal had taken shape over the past 5 days. Nora Dalton occupied a corner chair that she'd barely left except for bathroom breaks, and the occasional shower in the staff facilities a sympathetic nurse had offered. Her waitress uniform had been replaced by donated scrubs, and she clutched a rosary she hadn't touched since her husband's funeral, working the beads between raw, nervous fingers. Fallon sat beside her, the two of them having formed a bond forged in vigil and shared terror. The girl still wore her blood-stained jeans like a penitent's garment, though she'd accepted a clean shirt from her father. She read aloud for hours at a time from a battered paperback of The Outsiders that one of the bikers had brought her, her voice hoarse but steady. Grady came and went in shifts, coordinating with Callan and the other charters, making sure the watch never faltered, while also trying to be present for both his daughter and the boy who'd saved her. He'd spoken perhaps 200 words total in 5 days, but his presence filled rooms and commanded respect without effort. It was day 5 when everything changed. Dr. Brennan made the decision at dawn after reviewing Eli's vitals for the 4th time in an hour. The boy's numbers had stabilized beautifully over the past 72 hours. The infection markers were dropping. His body temperature had normalized. Most importantly, his brain activity showed proper response patterns when they reduced the sedation for testing. "We're going to start bringing him up," the doctor told Nora at 6:30 in the morning, gradually reducing the sedatives and letting him wake naturally. It could take hours. It could take a full day. Every patient responds differently. Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. Fallon gripped her hand tight enough to hurt. The process was agonizingly slow. The medical team dialed back the chemical twilight in incremental stages, watching Eli's responses with the intensity of engineers monitoring a rocket launch. First came small movements, a finger twitching, his eyelids fluttering without opening. his head turning slightly toward the sound of Fallon's voice as she read. By noon, his breathing had shifted from the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator to something more natural. The respiratory therapist made the call to remove the tube, a procedure that made Nora leave the room because she couldn't watch them pull plastic from her son's throat. Eli's first independent breath was shallow and raspy, his throat damaged from days of intubation. But it was his lungs filling and emptying on their own power, his body remembering how to perform the most basic function of staying alive. Fallon was alone in the room at 2:15 in the afternoon when his eyes finally opened. She'd been reading the same passage for the third time, stumbling over words she'd never had trouble with before exhaustion and stress, making her brain skip like a damaged record. Then she felt it, a change in the air, the weight of someone's attention. She looked up from the book. Eli's eyes were open, barely, slits of brown iris struggling to focus in the harsh fluorescent light. His pupils contracted and dilated as his brain tried to process consciousness after 5 days in chemical darkness. Fallon's breath caught. The book fell from her hands, pages fluttering as it hit the floor. Eli. His eyes found her face. Recognition flickered there, slow and uncertain, like watching someone remember a language they hadn't spoken in years. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His throat was too damaged, too raw. Don't try to talk. Fallon was out of her chair, hovering beside the bed, terrified to touch him and cause pain, but desperate for contact. You're in the hospital. You've been in a coma, but you're okay. You're going to be okay. Eli's hand moved on the sheets, a tiny gesture, fingers extending, maybe an inch. Fallon understood immediately. She took his hand in both of hers, careful of the IV lines, and felt his fingers squeeze weakly. I'm getting your mom and my dad and the doctors. Don't close your eyes. Please don't close your eyes. She hit the call button repeatedly, her other hand still holding his, and within seconds the room filled with medical personnel and Nora's sobbing and Grady's massive presence in the doorway. But Eli's eyes stayed locked on Fallon. His grip on her hand never loosened, and in those eyes beneath the confusion and the pain was a question that didn't need words. Are you safe? Did it work? I'm okay. Fallon understood, answering what he needed to know. Because of you. You saved me, Eli. Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then his eyes drifted closed again, not into unconsciousness, but into natural sleep, his body demanding rest to continue the work of healing. The first words Eli spoke came 16 hours after he woke, when his throat had recovered enough to manage more than a whisper. Nora was asleep in the chair beside him, her head tilted at an angle that would give her a terrible crick in her neck. Dawn light was creeping through the window, painting everything in shades of pearl and gold. Eli's voice came out like gravel sliding over broken glass. Mom. Nora's eyes snapped open. She was beside the bed instantly, hands hovering over him like she was afraid he might shatter if she touched him wrong. Baby, oh God, you're awake. How do you feel? Hurts. It was honest. Everything hurt. His stomach felt like it had been filleted and put back together wrong. His forearm throbbed where the first blade had torn through muscle. Even breathing sent sharp pains through his ribs. I know, sweetheart. I know. Nora's tears fell onto the sheets. The doctor said you're healing. You're going to be okay. Fallon, the name came out as barely more than breath. She's fine. Not a scratch on her because you, Nora's voice broke. Why did you do it, Eli? Why didn't you run? Eli's eyes found hers. Even damaged and weak, there was something solid in that gaze. Something that reminded Nora painfully of Calvin. Had to, couldn't let them hurt her. You could have died. I know. He said it simply, factually, like he'd known it then and had done it anyway. Still had to. Nora buried her face in the sheets beside his hand and wept. Not from sadness, but from a complicated mix of pride and terror, and the awful understanding that her son had crossed some invisible line between childhood and something else, something harder. The recovery was brutal, not the Hollywood montage of steady improvement and inspirational music. It was painful physical therapy sessions where Eli relearned how to sit up without his rebuilt core muscles screaming in protest. It was infection scares that sent his temperature spiking and brought the crash cart back to his room. It was the slowly dawning realization that his body would never be quite the same, that he'd carry scars both visible and internal for the rest of his life. But worse than the physical recovery was the mental aftermath. The nightmares came every time he closed his eyes. Vivid, visceral, the screech of tires, Wade's face, the moment the blade entered his body, replaying in perfect sensory detail. He'd wake gasping, thrashing against sheets that felt like restraints, his heart rate spiking so high the monitors brought nurses running. During the day, he could manage it, could focus on the therapy, on putting one foot in front of the other, on the small victories of being able to walk to the bathroom without assistance or eat solid food without nausea. But at night, alone in the dark with nothing to distract him, the fear came crawling back. What terrified him most wasn't the memory of the attack. It was the certainty that if it happened again, he'd be too scared to act. That the courage he'd found on Olive Drive had been a one-time chemical accident, adrenaline, and instinct rather than any real bravery. That when tested again, he'd freeze, or worse, run. He started refusing visitors, told his mother he was too tired when Fallon came by, pretended to be asleep when Grady stopped in during evening rounds. He couldn't face them, couldn't stand the way they looked at him like he was some kind of hero when all he felt was terrified and small and weak. On day 9, Grady Kane stopped pretending to respect Eli's wishes. He walked into the room at 2 in the afternoon without knocking, closed the door behind him with a finality that suggested he wasn't leaving until he was good and ready, and pulled a chair up beside Eli's bed. Eli kept his eyes on the ceiling. "I'm tired." "No, you're not." Grady's voice was matter-of-fact. "You're scared." That got Eli's attention. He turned his head, meeting Grady's eyes for the first time since waking. "I'm not." "Yes, you are. And that's fine. That's human." Grady leaned back in the chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "You want to tell me what's eating at you, or you want me to guess?" Eli's jaw tightened. "Why do you care?" "Because my daughter's sitting in the waiting room right now feeling like she killed you. Because your mother's running herself into the ground trying to be strong for you while you push everyone away. And because I recognize the look in your eyes. I've seen it in the mirror." Silence stretched between them. Outside the window, Bakersfield's afternoon heat made the air shimmer like liquid. "I keep seeing it," Eli finally whispered. "The knife, over and over. And in the dream, I'm not brave. I'm just terrified. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like I was going to and there was nothing I could do to stop it." "You think heroes don't feel that way?" Grady's question was gentle but challenging. "Real brave people don't get scared." "That's horseshit." The profanity was mild but firm. "You know what real courage is, kid? It's being scared out of your mind and doing the right thing anyway. Any idiot can walk into danger when they're too stupid to understand it. But you understood exactly what you were facing, and you stood in front of it anyway." "I didn't feel brave. I felt sick." "Most of the time, that's what brave feels like." Grady leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "First time I got into a real fight inside, I was 19 years old. 3 guys cornered me in the yard over some disrespect I didn't even understand. I knew I was about to get stomped, knew it in my bones. And you know what I felt?" Eli shook his head. "Terror, pure gut-churning terror. I wanted to curl up and beg, but I didn't. I threw the first punch because sitting there and taking it felt worse than fighting back. I got my ass kicked anyway. Spent 2 days in the infirmary, but I learned something important." "What?" "That fear doesn't make you a coward. Giving into it does." Grady's eyes held Eli's. "You gave my daughter time to run. You held off 4 grown men high on meth. You took 2 blades and didn't quit. That's not accidental. That's not luck. That's character. What if next time I freeze, what if I'm too scared to move? Then you deal with that when it happens. But you don't get to torture yourself over hypotheticals." Grady stood up, a mountain of a man unfolding from a plastic hospital chair. The boy who walked into those blades didn't know he was brave. He just knew someone needed help. That's the only kind of courage that matters. He started toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Fallon's in the waiting room. She's been there every day for 9 days. She blames herself for what happened to you. Maybe you could stop feeling sorry for yourself long enough to let her know you don't blame her. Then he was gone, leaving Eli alone with thoughts that felt slightly less suffocating. Fallon came in 10 minutes later, hesitant and uncertain in a way that looked all wrong on her. She hovered in the doorway like she wasn't sure she had permission to enter. "Hey." Eli's voice was still rough but stronger than it had been. "Hey." She took a few steps inside but didn't sit. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I just wanted to see you." "I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush. "For avoiding you. That wasn't fair. You got stabbed. You were allowed to process however you need to." But there was hurt in her voice underneath the understanding. "It wasn't about you. Eli struggled for words. "I was scared you'd see me differently, like I'm not the same person anymore." Fallon crossed the room and sat in the chair Grady had vacated. "You're not the same person. Neither am I. But that doesn't mean we can't still be friends." I keep replaying it, wondering if I should have done something different. "You saved my life, Eli. I don't know how to live with that. Don't know how to be worthy of it." "You don't have to be worthy of it. That's not how it works." Eli shifted in the bed, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I didn't think about worth or payback or any of that. I just saw you were in trouble and I couldn't walk away." "I know." Fallon's voice was small. "That's what makes it so hard." They sat in silence for a while. Not the uncomfortable silence of the past week, but something easier. A shared understanding that some things didn't need words. "My dad likes you," Fallon said eventually. "That's rare. He doesn't trust civilians usually, but he said you've got honor. That's basically the highest compliment he knows how to give." Eli thought about that, about this massive, terrifying man who led a motorcycle club and had probably done things Eli couldn't even imagine respecting a 14-year-old kid from Oildale. It felt surreal. "He's been good to my mom. The whole club has, making sure nobody bothers us, helping with stuff." Eli paused. "I don't really understand it." "The club takes care of their own, and apparently they decided you're one of their own now." "I'm not a biker." "No, but you bled for one. In their world, that's what matters." 4 months crawled past with agonizing slowness. Eli was discharged from the hospital after 3 weeks, but remained under strict medical supervision. Physical therapy twice a week, follow-up appointments, a strict regimen of antibiotics and pain management that turned every day into a careful calculation of what his body could handle. He didn't return to school, couldn't face the stares and whispers and the weight of being the kid who'd gotten stabbed. The district arranged for home tutoring a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who came 3 times a week and pretended not to notice when Eli zoned out mid-lesson, his mind elsewhere. Fallon visited regularly. They'd sit on his front porch and talk about nothing important, and slowly the friendship rebuilt itself on foundations that felt stronger for having been tested. She told him about school. He told her about the physical therapy exercises that felt like torture. They didn't talk about the attack unless one of them needed to, and even then, only in fragments. Grady stopped by occasionally, usually bringing food Nora hadn't asked for but desperately needed. He'd sit with Eli for a while, not saying much, just present, teaching by example that support didn't always require words. The nightmares faded slowly, not gone but less frequent, less vivid. Eli learned tricks to manage them, keeping a light on, playing music low, focusing on the pocket watch on his nightstand when he woke gasping in the dark. Then the legal system kicked into gear and everything got complicated again. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late February, 4 months after the attack. Wade Harrow had been denied bail, considered a flight risk and a danger to the community. He'd been transferred to Corcoran State Prison to await trial, and the rumors filtering back through the Angels network painted a picture of a man coming apart at the seams. Wade wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. He sat in his cell, staring at the walls, jumping at every sound, convinced that every shadow held someone sent by the club to make him suffer. The psychological torture Grady had promised was working exactly as intended. The district attorney's office contacted Nora 2 weeks before the hearing. They needed Eli to testify, to describe the attack in detail, to identify his assailant and provide the eyewitness testimony that would lock Wade away for decades. Eli said no, then said it again when they asked a second time. The thought of sitting in a courtroom reliving that day in front of strangers, and Wade and everyone else, made his stomach twist with nausea that had nothing to do with his injuries. "I can't do it, Mom. I can't sit there and talk about it." Nora didn't push, didn't argue. She just held him and said she'd figure something out. But Grady had other ideas. He showed up at the house 3 days before the hearing, knocking on the door with his characteristic mixture of courtesy and inevitability. Nora let him in and tactfully found somewhere else to be, leaving Eli and Grady alone in the small living room. "They told you about the hearing." It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Eli kept his eyes on his hands. "I'm not going." "Why not?" "Because I can't. Because standing up there in front of everyone and talking about it, I can't do it." "You can." Grady's voice was firm, but not harsh. "You just don't want to. There's a difference." Same result. Not even close to the same result. Grady sat down in the armchair across from Eli. "You don't testify, the case gets weaker. Maybe Wade still goes away. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he takes a plea deal for less time. Maybe in 10 years he's out and looking for payback." Eli's head snapped up. "You're trying to scare me into testifying." "I'm trying to make you understand that this isn't over just because you survived the knives. Wade made a choice to hurt you. Now you have to make a choice. Let him off easy or make him face what he did." "It's not about letting him off. It's about me not being able to sit in that room and relive the worst day of my life in front of strangers. I know it's hard. I know it's going to hurt. But you know what's harder? Living with yourself, knowing you had the chance to make sure he never does this to anyone else, and you didn't take it." Eli felt anger flash hot in his chest. "That's not fair." "Life's not fair, kid. You learned that on Olive Drive." Grady leaned forward. "But here's what I know about you. When it mattered, when Fallon needed someone to stand between her and danger, you didn't hesitate. You didn't run. You stood. This is the same thing, just a different kind of standing." "It's not the same. I was scared, but I didn't have time to think. This, I've got 3 days to think about it, to imagine it, to know exactly how bad it's going to be. Then use those 3 days to prepare instead of running." Grady's voice softened slightly. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll be there. Fallon will be there. Your mother. The whole club if you want. You walk into that courtroom and you'll see 200 men who rode through the night because you bled for one of their own. You think any of them are going to dare me to let Wade touch you? He doesn't need to touch me to hurt me. You're right. He hurt you already. Hurt you bad. But you know what takes away his power. Looking him in the eye and telling the truth. Showing him that he didn't break you." Eli wanted to argue, wanted to find a flaw in the logic, but he couldn't. Because underneath the fear and the resistance, he knew Grady was right. Running from the courtroom was just another kind of freezing, another kind of letting fear win. What if I can't do it? What if I get up there and fall apart? Then you fall apart and we put you back together. But at least you tried. Grady stood up. "I'm not going to force you, Eli. Nobody can make you testify if you don't want to. But I'm asking you to think about why you stood in front of those blades in the first place. Then ask yourself if that reason changed." The Kern County Superior Courthouse was a brutal modern building, all concrete and glass, in the aesthetic warmth of a prison. The courtroom itself was packed by 9 in the morning, every wooden bench filled with a mix of reporters, curious locals, and the unmistakable presence of the Hells Angels. The left side of the gallery held civilians. Nora sat in the front row, her hands twisted together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Behind her, reporters with notebooks and a few local busybodies who treated court proceedings like free entertainment. The right side of the courtroom was a sea of black leather. 28 angels occupied the benches in absolute silence, their presence transforming the space into something that felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a judgment from an older, harsher code. Grady sat in the front row next to Callan. Both men in their full cuts, the death's head patches seeming to stare at everyone and no one. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with 20 years on the job, stood straighter than usual. His hand rested near his belt, but he knew better than to see the bikers as a threat. They'd passed through the metal detectors, without complaint, checked their knives at security, and taken their seats with the kind of discipline that made it clear they were here for a specific purpose. At 9:30, the side door opened, and Eli was wheeled into the courtroom. He'd refused the wheelchair, initially stubborn and proud, but the walk from the parking lot had left him winded and his stomach screaming in protest. Pride wasn't worth collapsing in front of everyone. Fallon pushed the chair. She dressed carefully, wearing the same jeans she'd worn that day, washed now, but still carrying the ghost of bloodstains that wouldn't quite come out in a simple black shirt. A silent testament to what they'd survived together. As they came through the door, something remarkable happened. The 28 angels on the right side of the gallery stood up in perfect unison. The sound of boots on hardwood was like thunder. They didn't applaud, didn't speak, just stood in absolute silence, a wall of respect and recognition. Eli's breath caught. He'd known they'd be here, but seeing it was different. Feeling the weight of their regard, understanding what it meant in their world to earn this kind of acknowledgement. The gesture said more than words could, "You are one of ours. We stand for you." Judge Patricia Morrison, a severe woman with steel gray hair and 30 years on the bench, looked at the bikers with an expression that suggested she was calculating whether to order them to sit or let the moment play out. She chose wisdom over protocol. "Please be seated." The angels sat as one. The sound echoed. Eli was wheeled to a position beside the prosecutor's table. Richard Sterling, the district attorney, was a polished man in his late 40s who'd built a career on putting away violent criminals. He leaned down to speak quietly to Eli. "You ready for this?" Eli nodded because speaking felt impossible. His mouth was dry as sand. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "The case of the state of California versus Wade Harrow. Charges of attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and assault of a minor." The side door opened again. Two corrections officers brought Wade into the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit that hung off a frame that had lost at least 30 pounds. Wade looked like a corpse that hadn't gotten the memo it was dead. His skin had a grayish pallor. His eyes were sunken into dark hollows. His hands trembled constantly, a fine motor shake that suggested either withdrawal or psychological collapse. When Wade's eyes swept the courtroom and landed on the wall of bikers, he made a sound. Not quite a scream, more like a whimper that had clawed its way out of a shattered psyche. His knees buckled. The corrections officers had to physically hold him upright. "Mr. Harrow, please take your seat." Judge Morrison's voice was ice. Wade was half dragged to the defense table. His public defender, a tired-looking woman named Janet Reeves, put a hand on his shoulder in what might have been reassurance. Wade flinched away from the touch. The prosecution may call its first witness. Richard Sterling stood. "Your Honor, the state calls Eli Dalton." This was it. The moment Eli had been dreading for 3 days. Fallon squeezed his shoulder once, then stepped back. Two court officers helped him stand from the wheelchair and navigate the 3 steps up to the witness box. Each step sent pain lancing through his abdomen, but he kept his face neutral. Wouldn't give Wade the satisfaction of seeing him hurt. The bailiff administered the oath. Eli's voice came out stronger than he'd expected. "I do." He sat carefully in the witness chair, adjusting his position to minimize the pull on his still healing core muscles. Then he made himself look up, made himself meet the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, and found Grady's gaze. The big man gave him the smallest nod. just a fractional movement of his chin, but in that gesture was everything Eli needed. You can do this. We're here. Sterling approached with the careful courtesy of someone handling fragile evidence. Eli, can you tell the court what happened on November 15th of last year? Eli took a breath. He'd practiced this with his mother, with the victim's advocate the DA's office had assigned. He knew what he had to say, but knowing and doing were different countries separated by an ocean of fear. I was walking home with my friend Fallon Kane. We were on Olive Drive around 4:30 in the afternoon. What happened next? A car cut us off. A Chevy Impala. 4 men got out. Eli's voice stayed steady, but his hands gripped the arms of the chair. One of them had a tire iron. He said something about Fallon's father. Then they tried to grab her. What did you do? I tried to stop them. Can you be more specific? Eli's eyes found Wade across the courtroom. The man was trembling, staring at the table, refusing to look up. I threw myself at the biggest one, tried to knock him off balance so Fallon could run. It didn't work. He threw me into a fence, but I got back up and tackled the man with the tire iron. Wade Harrow. You tackled Mr. Harrow. Yes, I held on to his legs so Fallon could get away. She ran, but then Eli's voice caught. The memory was right there, vivid and immediate. He pulled out a knife, switchblade, about 6 inches. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, caught in the raw honesty of Eli's testimony. What happened with the knife, Eli? I tried to protect my face. The blade went through my forearm. Then I dropped my guard, and he stabbed me in the stomach. Upward thrust. I felt it go in. Eli's hand moved unconsciously to his abdomen, to where the scar tissue pulled tight under his shirt. I looked down, and there was blood everywhere. My blood. I couldn't breathe right. Everything got cold. Did Mr. Harrow say anything? He asked if I wanted to die for some biker's kid I barely knew. Eli's eyes finally lifted to Wade's face, and I realized I didn't barely know her. She was my friend, and I'd do it again. That broke something in Wade. He looked up finally and met Eli's gaze. What he saw there wasn't the dying boy from his nightmares. It was someone who'd survived, someone who'd taken the worst Wade could dish out and come back stronger. Wade started to shake harder. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. Your Honor, Janet Reeves started to stand, but Wade was faster. He grabbed the microphone on the defense table, his shackles rattling. Guilty. The word came out as a shriek. I did it. I'm guilty. All of it. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel came down like a gunshot. Order, Mr. Harrow, you need to consult with your attorney before. I don't care. Wade was standing now. Guards moving toward him, but uncertain how to proceed. I stabbed him. I meant to kill him. Just put me in solitary, the hole anywhere. They can't get to me. His wild eyes swept to the angels. They're everywhere. Every shadow. I can't sleep. I can't. He collapsed. Not dramatically, just crumpled, like someone had cut his strings. The corrections officers caught him before he hit the floor. Janet Reeves looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Your Honor, I request a recess to consult with my client about his mental state. Granted. Judge Morrison looked shaken. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. But everyone in the courtroom knew it was over. Wade had confessed, had pleaded guilty in open court to attempted murder. Whatever legal maneuvering might follow the outcome was decided. Eli sat in the witness box, trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. He'd done it. He'd faced Wade. He'd told the truth, and Wade had broken before he had. Grady caught his eye across the courtroom and smiled. It wasn't his usual hard expression. It was genuine pride, the kind of look a father gives a son who's accomplished something difficult and important. Eli felt something shift inside him. A weight he hadn't known he was carrying lifted just a little bit. He wasn't the same terrified kid who'd woken up in the ICU. He was someone who'd faced his fear and walked through it. Someone who'd earned the respect of men who didn't give it lightly. 3 months after the hearing, Summer returned to Oildale with oppressive heat and the smell of hot asphalt. Eli had been home from the hospital for 7 months. He could walk without pain most days, could run a little, though his endurance was shot, and probably would be for years. The scar across his abdomen had faded from angry red to pale pink, a ridge of tissue that pulled tight when he moved wrong. He'd returned to school for the last month of the year, endured the stares and whispers, and the way kids either avoided him or tried to be his best friend for the story. He'd hated all of it and counted down the days until summer break. But summer brought its own problem, a crushing, insurmountable problem that had been building in the background while Eli focused on healing. The medical bills had arrived in waves. First, the hospital stay. 23 days in intensive and acute care at rates that would have been obscene if they weren't destroying his mother's life. Then the surgeries, the emergency trauma team, the specialists, the follow-up care and physical therapy and medications. The insurance Nora had through the diner covered some of it. Not enough, not even close. The final tally after insurance adjustments and charity care applications and every possible discount came to $127,000. It might as well have been $1 billion. Nora tried to hide it from him, tried to handle it alone the way she'd handled everything since Calvin died. But Eli found the notices, past due stamps in red ink, collection agency letters, a notice that their landlord had received a judgment lien on their property for unpaid medical debt. He found his mother crying in the kitchen one night, surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, and something inside him crystallized into hard determination. "I'm getting a job," he said. Nora looked up, her face blotchy and exhausted. "Baby, you're 14, and you're still recovering. I'm well enough to work. Henderson would probably take me back at the hardware store. Or I could, even if you worked full-time making minimum wage, it wouldn't make a dent, Eli. This is adult money. This is the kind of debt that takes decades to pay off." "Then we start now." Eli sat down across from her. "I'm not letting you lose the house because I got stabbed. This is not your fault. I know it's not my fault, but it's still happening because of me. So I'm going to help fix it." They argued in circles for an hour. Nora insisted he focus on school. Eli insisted he'd already lost half a year and could catch up while working. They finally reached an exhausted stalemate where neither convinced the other, but both were too tired to keep fighting. Eli lay in bed that night thinking about the numbers, thinking about his mother's red eyes and the weight she carried in the fundamental unfairness of being punished financially for surviving. Then he thought about the Hells Angels, about the 200 men who'd stood watch at the hospital, about Grady's quiet presence and the way the club took care of their own. And he made a decision that terrified and excited him in equal measure. The next morning, he borrowed his mother's phone and called Grady's number, the one the big man had written on a scrap of paper and left on their kitchen table weeks ago, saying, "If you need anything." Grady answered on the second ring. "Yeah, it's Eli Dalton. I know who you are, kid. What's up? I need to talk to you in person. It's important. You okay? Something wrong?" "I'm fine. I need to ask you something. Can I come by?" There was a pause, then, "You know where the clubhouse is?" No. "I'll pick you up, 20 minutes. Grady pulled up to the house on his Road King exactly 20 minutes later. Eli had never been on a motorcycle before. The vibration of the engine between his legs felt alien and exciting. Grady handed him a helmet that was way too big and told him to hold on tight. They rode through Oildale in the late morning heat, the wind tearing at Eli's clothes, the world blurring into something immediate and visceral. Grady didn't go to the clubhouse. He took them to a small garage on the industrial side of town, a nondescript building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Kane Custom Motors." Inside the garage was a temple to mechanical precision. Motorcycles in various states of assembly filled the space. Tools hung on pegboards with the kind of organization that spoke to a craftsman's mind. The smell of oil and metal and leather was overwhelming. Grady killed the engine and dismounted. "This is my shop. What I do when I'm not riding. What did you want to talk about?" Eli took off the too big helmet, his hair sticking up in awkward spikes. The medical bills from the hospital, it's more than my mom can pay. A lot more. We're going to lose the house. Grady's expression didn't change. How much? After insurance, 127,000. The number hung in the air between them, a debt so large it felt abstract. I want to work it off, Eli said quickly before he lost his nerve. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a job. Here at your shop. I'll do anything. Sweep floors, organize parts, learn to work on bikes. I don't care, but I need to help my mom, and I can't do it making $9 an hour at the hardware store. Grady studied him for a long moment. You know I could just write a check for that. I know, but I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me earn it. Why? Because I chose to stand in front of those knives, and I'm choosing to deal with what came after. I don't want to be rescued. I want to fix it myself. Grady's face did something Eli had never seen before. The hard edges softened into something that might have been respect or recognition or both. You ever work on engines before? My dad showed me some stuff before he died. Basic maintenance, oil changes, nothing serious. You're 14. State says you can't work more than certain hours, and you're still healing. I'll work within the limits, and I'll be careful with my body, but I need this Mr. Kane. I need to feel like I'm doing something instead of just being a victim who got lucky. Grady walked over to a workbench, picked up a wrench, turned it over in his massive hands. I'm not going to let your mother lose her house, Eli, with or without you working for it. The club owes you a debt. We pay our debts. I know what you don't want. You're making that real clear. Grady turned back to face him. But here's what I want you to understand. You didn't just take a blade from my daughter. You showed me something about character that I don't see often. Not in my world, not anywhere. He crossed back to where Eli stood. So here's the deal. The club's already planned a poker run for next month. Big one. Multiple charters riding. All proceeds go to covering your medical bills. That's happening whether you like it or not. Eli opened his mouth to protest, but Grady held up one hand. But, he continued, you still want to work for it? Fine, you can come here 3 days a week. I'll teach you how to work on bikes, real work, not scrubbing floors. You'll learn engines and transmissions and how to rebuild carburetors. You'll earn a paycheck based on the work you do, not charity. Fair, more than fair. And Eli, you're not doing this because you owe me. You're doing it because you want to learn something, because you want to build something with your hands. You understand? Eli nodded slowly, understanding that Grady was reframing the entire transaction, turning it from desperation into opportunity, from debt into mentorship. When can I start? Next Monday. Bring work clothes you don't mind ruining. And maybe don't tell your mother that half the bikes you'll be working on belong to Hell's Angels. She might not sleep. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon that felt more like autumn than summer, 4 motorcycles pulled up to the small house on Beardsley Street. Grady, Cal, and Axel, and a younger member Eli had seen around the shop named Shiv. Nora came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Eli followed, moving better than he had in months, his body finally remembering how to exist without constant pain. Afternoon, ma'am. Callan nodded respectfully. Mind if we take a few minutes of your time? Of course not. You want to come inside? We're good out here. Grady reached into his cut and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Got something for you. Nora took it hesitantly. She opened the clasp and pulled out the contents. Cashier's checks from multiple sources, smaller donations in cash, and at the bottom a receipt from Bakersfield Memorial Hospital stamped in green ink, paid in full. Her hands started shaking. She looked at the numbers, looked at Grady, looked at the receipt again like it might disappear if she blinked. How this is over $100,000. Poker run last weekend, went up into the mountains. Angels from all over the state wanted to buy in. Turned into a bigger thing than we planned. Grady's voice was matter of fact, like he was describing the weather. People wanted to support the kid who held the line. Nora's knees gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, still clutching the envelope, and started to cry. Not delicate tears, but huge, racking sobs that came from a place deeper than gratitude. Eli sat down beside her, putting his arm around his mother's shoulders. He looked up at Grady with something fierce and complicated in his eyes. "Thank you. I don't know how to—" "You already thanked us," Callan interrupted, "on Olive Drive. Everything after that is just us keeping our word." Grady walked back to his Road King and untied a leather bundle from the sissy bar. He brought it back and unrolled it on the hood of Nora's ancient sedan. Inside was a black leather vest, not a cut, no club patches, no death's head, but over the left breast, embroidered in red and white thread, was a custom patch. It read, "San Bernardino Hells Angels, Honorary Defender, Ironclad Shield." Grady picked up the vest and held it out to Eli. "You're too young to prospect. Your mother would kill me, and she'd be right. But you wear this, and every man who rides in California knows who you are and what you did." Eli stood up slowly, took the vest in hands that trembled slightly. The leather was soft and worn, obviously not new, obviously significant. "This isn't for getting hurt," Grady continued, and his voice carried a weight that made even the other angels stand a little straighter. "This is for standing when you could have run, for choosing right over easy, for showing us all what real courage looks like." Eli put the vest on. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for him. The weight of it on his shoulders felt significant, a responsibility and an honor braided together. "One more thing," Grady added. "Job offers still open at the shop. Not to work off a debt that's already paid, but because I could use an apprentice who actually gives away a damn about doing things right. You interested?" Eli looked at his mother. Nora wiped her eyes and nodded, some complicated emotion crossing her face. Pride, fear, acceptance that her boy had grown up faster than she'd wanted, but maybe in a way that mattered. "Yeah," Eli said. "I'm interested." "Good. See you Monday at 8. Grady mounted his Road King, the other angels following suit. "Oh, and Eli Fallon's down at Millie's Diner. Probably wouldn't hurt to stop by and say hello." The four engines roared to life in sequence. They pulled away from the curb in formation, riding down the quiet residential street of Oildale with a dignity that transformed the moment into something ceremonial. Eli stood in the driveway wearing his vest, watching them disappear around the corner. Nora came up beside him and put her arm around his waist, careful of his healing scar. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Working with them, being part of that world." "I'm not part of their world, Mom, but they're part of mine now, and I think that's okay." They stood together in the afternoon sun, holding the envelope that represented freedom from crushing debt and the vest that represented something harder to define: respect, brotherhood, the complicated honor of men who live by a code most people would never understand. Later that afternoon, Eli walked to Millie's Diner. Fallon was sitting in a booth near the window, sketching in a notebook, her combat boots propped up on the opposite seat. When she saw him walk in wearing the vest, her face lit up with a smile that made everything he'd been through feel worth it. "Nice jacket," she said as he slid into the booth. "Thanks. Some dangerous bikers gave it to me." "Lucky you." They sat and talked about nothing important, about music and moss and whether the stray they'd been feeding should be named Wrench or Scout, about starting high school in the fall and what that might be like, about the future in the careful, hopeful way teenagers do when they've seen how fast everything can change. Through the window, Oildale stretched out in all its sun-baked glory, still a hard place, still unforgiving, but also home, also familiar, also theirs in a way that felt more earned than given. And somewhere in the mountains north of Bakersfield, on winding roads that carved through pine forests and granite cliffs, 200 motorcycles rode in formation, not going anywhere particular, just riding, celebrating, honoring a boy who'd shown them that courage wasn't about patches or colors or belonging to a club. It was about standing up when everything in you screamed to run, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, about choosing what was right over what was easy, even when the cost was measured in blood and pain and scars that would never fully fade. The boy who'd taken two blades on a sidewalk in Oildale had taught them all something they thought they already knew. And in return, they'd given him something most kids never got: a family forged, not in blood, but in the harder metal of earned respect and proven honor. 10 years later, on another California afternoon that felt suspended between seasons, a young man stood in the doorway of a garage called Dalton and Kane Custom Motors. The sign was new, painted by a local artist, but the garage itself had been there for over a decade. Eli Dalton was 24 now, still lean but filled out through the shoulders from years of working with his hands. The scar across his abdomen was still visible when he reached for something high on a shelf, a ridge of pale tissue that told a story to anyone who knew to look. He wore his vest most days, not because he had to, but because it felt right. The patches had aged with him, the leather, soft and worn, the embroidered letters faded but still legible. Honorary Defender. He'd earned that title at 14 and had spent the decade since trying to live up to it. The garage was doing well. Better than well. Word had spread through the riding community that this was a place where the work was honest and the craftsmanship mattered. Angels still brought their bikes here, but so did civilians. Weekend riders and commuters, and anyone who wanted their machine treated with respect. Fallon worked the front desk most days when she wasn't taking classes at Bakersfield College. They dated for a while in high school, decided they were better as friends, and settled into a partnership that felt more sustainable than romance. She handled the business side while Eli handled the wrenches. It worked. Grady Grayer now, but no less formidable, stopped by most afternoons to drink coffee and supervise projects with the critical eye of a master watching his apprentice become a craftsman. He'd officially retired from active club duties, but still wore his colors and still commanded respect without effort. On this particular afternoon, a boy walked into the garage pushing a bicycle with a broken chain. He couldn't have been more than 12, skinny, nervous, the kind of kid who'd learned to be invisible. Eli looked up from the soft tail he was rebuilding, wiped grease from his hands and smiled. Chain came off. Yeah, I don't know how to fix it. Let's see what we're working with. Eli knelt on the shop floor, his movements practiced and sure, and examined the bicycle. The master link was worn through, same as it had been on a Schwinn cruiser 10 years ago on a sidewalk in Oildale. Some patterns repeated, some lessons got passed forward. This is an easy fix, Eli said, reaching for his toolbox. I can show you how to do it yourself if you want. So next time you won't need help. The boy's eyes lit up. Really? Really? Pull up that stool. This'll take about 5 minutes. As Eli worked explaining each step, showing the kid how to thread the chain and replace the master link and check the tension, he caught sight of his father's pocket watch sitting on the workbench. He'd had it repaired years ago. It kept time now, ticking steadily, but he still carried it more as a reminder than a timepiece. Do what's right, not what's easy. The words had cost him blood and pain and months of recovery, but they'd also given him purpose, a code to live by, a way to navigate a world that was still hard and still unforgiving, but also held spaces for honor and decency and the kind of courage that didn't require patches or colors. Just a choice, made again and again, to stand instead of run, to help instead of ignore, to be the kind of man who made the scared, invisible kids feel seen. The bicycle chain clicked into place. The boy spun the pedals, experimentally grinning when everything moved smooth and quiet. Thanks, mister. What do I owe you? Nothing. It's a master link. Come back if you need help with anything else. The kid rode away, wobbling slightly on fresh repairs, and Eli went back to his work. The soft tail wasn't going to rebuild itself, and he had standards to maintain. Grady had taught him that. Excellence wasn't accidental. It was a choice you made with every turn of a wrench, every adjustment, every detail that mattered. Through the open bay door, California sunshine painted everything gold. Somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine roared to life, that distinctive Harley rumble that Eli knew like his own heartbeat. The sound made him smile. He'd started with a broken bicycle chain and a girl who needed help. He'd bled for it, fought for it, survived it. And on the other side of all that pain and fear, he'd found something most people spent their whole lives searching for: a place to belong, a purpose worth the cost, and the quiet, certain knowledge that when the moment came to choose between right and easy, he'd always know which path to take. The vest hung on a hook near the workbench, leather worn soft by time and use. Honorary defender, ironclad shield. Words that meant something because they'd been earned the hard way. The only way that ever really mattered. And in a town called Oildale, where the heat was brutal and the streets were hard and reputation was the only currency that counted, a boy who'd taken two blades and refused to quit had become a man who taught scared kids how to fix broken chains and stand a little taller. The story that started with blood on asphalt ended with grease under fingernails and the steady, patient work of building something that would last.